Introduce our speaker today, Dr. Steve Rains. Steve Rains is a professor of communication at the University of Arizona. His research is situated in the area of health communication, social influence, and communication technology. He is interested in better understanding how and why messages influence people, particularly in health contexts and when using communication technologies. His work in recent years has primarily focused on social support, though he routinely studies digital coping, incivility, persuasion resistance, and related topics. He is especially interested in leveraging computational social science techniques to explore the dynamic communication processes involved in this phenomenon. So I'm reading this bio Steve sent me. Dr. Ring has been very much modest in this bio because I know he is a leading scholar in health communication, has published numerous articles in peer-reviewed journal, and his work is very well cited. So I'm very pleased to have Steve here today to give us a talk. Not maybe Steve, let me know if it's wrong. It's like something you picked up during the COVID pandemic. And I know your work has focused a lot on communication technology, but you've also done a lot of work on psychological reactance. So I can see why you want to look into the COVID pandemic through the lens of psychological reactance theory. So Steve, go ahead. If I miss anything in the bio, feel free to let us know. You can also share your presentation. I believe you can do that right now. So just take over the stage.
All right, thanks, Jali. And thanks to all of you. I appreciate the opportunity to get to share some of my work with you. I can't see what's on your screen.
It looks good. It has a presentation and everything. Yeah.
Oh, good. So it's okay, not the perfect. So given the nature of this colloquium, I thought that about health communication, I thought what I would do is talk about some of the work that my colleagues and I have conducted looking at psychological reactance theory in the context of COVID mandates. And I know that we're over COVID. I know that we don't want to talk about COVID. The pandemic is something we'd rather all forget because it was traumatizing, and I totally agree. Personally, it wasn't. I know that for all of us as humans, it wasn't a pleasant time, and I hope that I'm not glorifying it in any way. But I think from the perspective of our day jobs as behavioral scientists, it was an absolutely fascinating time. A lot of the theory that we talk about really kind of came to life, and it was played out in different ways. And so what I felt like from somebody who has been interested in psychological reactance since I was a graduate student 20 years ago, I started seeing these like natural experiments occurring, particularly in the context of mandates. And so what my collaborators and I wanted to do was see if we could use the pandemic as a means to test some newish, I'll call them, or novel ideas about a really old theory in this context. And so, one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that we mandated all these behaviors, which is fairly new for us in the US. I mean, we've done it with seatbelts and smoking indoors. It's not unheard of, but it is when we come to like individual health behaviors like mask wearing and vaccines. And so what we've done is conducted a series of studies looking at those, the effects of those mandates through the lens of reactance theory. So as a jumping off point, states impose mandates. I know most of you are aware of this. We lived through it. In Maryland, for example, there was a mandate to wear a face covering in public spaces, and that was issued by your governor on April 18th. It expired about a year later, and the premise was that everyone in the state has to wear a mask in these public spaces. Later that year, actually the next year, in 2021, the governor issued a vaccine requirement. So the idea was that State employees in 38 facilities, I'm assuming it was the University of Maryland, are required to receive a COVID vaccination or undergo weekly testing. And these mandates were not uncommon. They cropped up across the country in different states, and they weren't all uniform, but they were similar in that they tended to focus on masks and they tend to focus on vaccinations. And the details might be a little bit different. But what also stood out to me is that they didn't occur in every state. So my state of Arizona, we didn't have a vaccine mandate at all. Other states actually posed restrictions on imposing mandates. So they said you or entities within the state are not allowed to create mandates, which is a really novel thing from the perspective of psychological reactance theory. And so when in seeing all these mandates, one of the things we began to wonder is, well, wait a minute, aren't these mandates actually freedom restrictions? And some of the early work during the pandemic that came out right as mandates were being discussed was think pieces. And one of them was basically said, mandates have the potential to limit freedom, and they can thereby create reactance. And I thought, that's a really compelling point. And I went back and I looked at some of Brehm and Brehm's earliest work. This is their 1981 book here. And they say that the passage of restrictive laws is what they call an impersonal freedom threat. And so the premise is that by requiring people to wear masks or get a vaccine, we're removing their freedom to choose to do that behavior. So their autonomy has been restricted. And the potential of doing that is that it can create psychological reactance and lead them to reject the very behavior that's being advocated. And so in the scholarly literature, there was a lot of hand wringing, like, I don't know what's going to happen with these mandates. Could they backfire? And it occurred to me that was an empirical question. And so that's something we can actually explore. And so what we've done then is conducted a series of studies that I'd like to talk about today, in which we begin to look at what are the implications of these mandates. And in particular, what we realized is, well, we can use these mandates to kind of ask some novel questions about psychological reactance theory. The pandemic really created this almost novel natural experiment that allows us to test some ideas that haven't really been considered in depth. So what I want to do today is cover four studies and cover that address three different topics related to reactance. The first involves threatening versus protecting freedoms. As I mentioned, Maryland imposed a mask mandate, but other states didn't. And other states actually imposed restrictions. And those restrictions are novel because what they're actually doing is, from the perspective of psychological reactance theory, they're protecting freedoms. So whereas a mandate requires you to engage in a behavior and takes away your freedom, these bans, what we're calling bans on restrictions, actually protect freedom. And that's something that hasn't been studied, I don't think, at all in reactance theory. Reactance theory is mostly about taking away freedoms and what happens. And so what we saw in the pandemic is that people are actually having their freedom bolstered or supported. And so that raises some novel theoretical questions is, okay, well, what does that mean from the perspective of reactance? What happens if we give or we protect a freedom? Another thing that came out was freedom threat directedness. Now, there's a little bit of research. There's a study from the 70s and some other more recent stuff that looks at what happens when we observe others have their freedom threatened. So most of the research on reactance looks at when a message limits an audience's freedom, how do they respond? So the other way it could work is there could be a kind of a vicarious reactance where I observe others have their freedom threatened. And when I read that first study from the 70s, the manipulation is really kind of bizarre. It's like somebody's taken a quiz and then someone else, and then they have their freedom restricted. And there's another student who's the actual subject who watches the whole thing. And, it was like, this is bizarre. Like, when would this happen in everyday life? Well, it turns out in the pandemic. Like I said, I in Arizona didn't have any vaccination restrictions placed on me, but I did see you all in Maryland have them, and people in California and people in New Mexico. And so in that way, there's the potential for an indirect freedom threat. And so we're going to look at that in a couple of studies. The last thing we'll look at is this idea of the politicization of freedom. One of the things I think that was very obvious to me is during the pandemic is that health behavior is now political. And you know, I know it has been in pockets here and there, but it just felt like everything related to the pandemic and health became politicized. And so it becomes important to look at that. Like how do political ideology play out in response to freedom threats? The other thing we look at is threat removal. And threat removal, most of the reactance research looks at, okay, if I take away your freedom, what happens? We actually were able to test what happens when I give your freedom back. So what happens when there's a mask mandate and it gets removed? Do we see the opposite of what happens when it gets taken away? And so we'll talk about these 3 topics across 4 studies. I have a group of excellent collaborators I'll call out when we get to the individual studies as we go. Okay, so before we get started though, I'm going to do a very brief high-level overview of psychological reactance theory. So psychological reactance theory was developed by Brehm in the 60s, and the premise is that people, Americans in particular, value our personal freedom, and we value our autonomy. And this is hard baked into who we are as people. So we think that we have the freedom to act, and we have the freedom to speak, and we have the freedom to do things, assuming we're not harming others. And when that freedom gets threatened, we experience what Brehm calls a motivational state that he labels as reactance. And so if you think about the time period, this was coming out at the same time as dissonance. It's not an emotion, it's this motivational state. And what it leads people to do is restore their threatened freedom. So it energizes people to get their freedom back. The way they do this most commonly is through what's called direct restoration. So if you limit my freedom, I'm going to do the very behavior that's been limited. So in the case of binge drinking, if you tell students not to binge drink, they binge drink more. If you tell smokers they can't smoke, they smoke more. You know, even I tell my undergrads, you know, they come home from college that first semester, their parents say your curfew's 10, or 11 or whatever, and they say, well, I'm coming home 4 hours after that because I'm going to show you. So the idea is restoration in direct form involves people enacting the very behavior that's been limited. There are other ways to restore freedom as well. We can do it indirectly, and we're going to kind of get into that as we go and talk about some different ways that people restored their freedoms that were limited by mandates. Okay, so with that foundation in place, I'll talk about our first study. And excuse me, it's allergy season here in Tucson. And, you know, I know it's an allergy, but I'm sure you're thrilled this is still virtual anyway. No one wants to be near anyone sick. So my co-author on this paper is Adam Richards, who is a very proud Maryland alum. And what Adam and I got to talking about was that during the pandemic, we had a number of states that imposed these mandates on vaccination, right? So we talked about Maryland. You all imposed, or your governor imposed a mandate that required people to get their vaccination, or there were some kind of penalties, like they had to be tested. What stood out to us, though, was that there were also 22 states that imposed what we're calling bans on vaccination requirements. So these states came up with, they weren't laws, but they were like executive orders or policies that prevented any kind of legislation within their boundaries that would serve to require vaccination. So let me give you a couple of examples here. As we talked about Maryland, 38 facilities were required to receive a vaccine or undergo testing, right? And so that's what's happened to you all. Like I suspect you were probably subject to this. Alabama did the opposite. Alabama said, okay, what we're going to do is we're not going to allow any of this to happen. So we are going to prohibit state and local governments and businesses from denying services or admission based on proof of vaccination, or issuing any documents that would certify vaccination status. So we're going to undercut your ability, or we're going to undercut anybody's ability in the state to impose any kind of requirements on vaccination. And so from the perspective of psychological reactance theory, imposing a mandate is a freedom threat. It takes away your choice to get a vaccine. You're no longer, if you're a state employee, you're obligated to do it. That's the premise, at least. And so from the perspective of reactance theory, it's a freedom threat. And, we can talk about whether or not you think it's warranted and all that stuff, but at the end of the day, it still fits the form of a freedom threat. Now, in these banned states, what Adam and I are arguing is that this is actually protecting freedom. And so what I mean by that is, from the perspective of psychological reactance theory, what this legislation does is it effectively says, no one in the state can require you to get a vaccination. We are upholding your freedom to choose whether or not you want to be vaccinated. And so this is novel, we thought, at least from in the context of reactance, because reactance almost exclusively looks at what happens when we take away people's freedom. Well, this is saying, well, what happens when we protect people's freedom? And so what we wanted to do is we wondered, how does this affect vaccination behavior and vaccination rates? Like, what were the implications of these policies on actual behavior? And so what we did is we got data from the CDC on vaccination rates, and we tested some of these ideas. And so the banned states, they were clever. They banned vaccinations right as it became available. So most of the bans came out in like April-ish 2021. And as you know, most of us got vaccinated during that spring of 2021. So we couldn't do a pre-post. But in the mandate states where they impose vaccination, we could. And most of the mandates came out later, like September. I believe yours was in close to that time. And so we could do a pre-post and begin to look at what are the effects. So there are other variables in the model here. What I'm going to do with all these presentations is I'm going to hit the highlights as they're relevant to my talk. If you're interested in more details, you're welcome to see the original work. But what we did is the CDC had case rates in every state of the United States. And so all of our analyses, except for in one study, are all state level. So the unit of observation is a state and a week within a state. So it's actually, sorry. So the unit of observation is a 1 week within a state. And what we looked at is new vaccinations as reported by the CDC. And what we did then is we looked at, okay, so what happened in the 8 weeks before and after mandates were imposed? So for every state, we found the mandate week would be 0, and we looked at 8 weeks before and 8 weeks after. And what we found was there was no difference. There was no change in vaccination behavior from before to after the imposition of mandates. We did a sensitivity analysis where let's shrink this time frame down to 4 weeks before and after. We found no difference. Let's expand it. So we expanded it to 16 weeks before and after. We found no difference. In this plot, I've showed you what this is the data from the individual states that imposed a mandate. And here's your state, Maryland. On the X, we have weeks before and after the mandate. So it runs from -8 to +8. And on the Y here, we have number of new vaccinations per 100K residents. So if we look right in the center here of Maryland, it's pretty flat. There's nothing going on there. And that was the case for all the states that we examined. There was just no difference before and after. So what we're seeing that in these data is that reactance didn't lead to any direct restoration. What we would expect from a direct restoration prediction is that if mandates are problematic, then we're going to see lower new vaccinations after mandates than before. But we didn't see that whether we looked from 4 weeks before and after to 8 weeks before and after to 16 weeks before and after. There was consistently no difference. But we did find some indirect effects of mandates versus bans. So what we did is we did a second set of analyses, and in this case, we're comparing mandates to bans, and we looked at their effects on voluntary vaccination behaviors. So we looked at whether or not people adopted boosters. We looked at adult flu vaccination and then child flu vaccination rates. And these data are all from fall 2021 to spring 2022. They all come from the CDC. And what they entail is within a state, what proportion of people, we adjusted it so as proportion of people who were vaccinated, who were eligible for a booster, who got the booster, and then it would just be the proportion of adults and children who got the flu vaccine. And what we found was that we found a consistent trend where mandate states had lower adoption of these voluntary vaccines than did ban states. And that effect was modified by vaccination rates. So when vaccination rates were the lowest, which is the people who were most potentially reactant in those states, that's where we saw the lowest uptake of all of these voluntary vaccines when there was a mandate versus a ban. So let's look at these plots here. So this is the boosters, our analysis on the Y. We have booster, the proportion of people in a state who got a booster. On the X, we have vaccinations, whether they were banned, and a banned means what happened in Alabama. So nobody is allowed to impose any sort of freedom restriction, or whether mandated, where we get a freedom restriction, like in Maryland. What you can see is overall, vaccine or booster rates are lower in these mandate states where there's a freedom restriction than they are in the ban states. But they're even lowest when in states where COVID vaccine adoption was low. So what's happening is when COVID adoption is low, COVID vaccine adoption, these people are prone to reactance, right? They're the group who didn't want the vaccine the most. We see them react most strongly to mandates by being least likely to get boosters. We saw the exact same thing in child flu vaccination. So we have child flu vaccination on the Y. On the X, we have requirements are banned or mandated, and we again see vaccination rates are lower when COVID-19 is mandated versus banned, and it's lowest in these states where vaccination adoption was lowest. So people didn't want the vaccine. They're mandated, some portion of the population is mandated to get it. And so they say, well, I'll show you, I'm going to get the vaccine, but I'm not getting the booster, or I'm not having my kids vaccinated relative to some of these other groups. For adult flu vaccination, we just found a main effect where we have mandate states are lower than ban states. So if I can kind of summarize this, what we found was that relative to bans on vaccine requirements, which what we're calling freedom protection, so that's what happened in Alabama, these mandates, these freedom threats, like what happened in Maryland, had some unintended consequences. They didn't directly lead to lower vaccination rates, but we did see indirect freedom restoration consistent with psychological reactance theory. So people in Maryland said, I'm fine, I got it. People in our state have to get have to get vaccinated due to the mandate. Fine, I'll do it. But you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not getting the booster. I'm not getting my kids vaccinated. I'm not getting flu vaccine. And just so I'm clear, I'm not saying everyone did that. I'm saying they were more likely to do that relative to people who had, relative to states where there was bans on these vaccinations. So, I think what this offers us is some evidence of this indirect freedom restoration in the context of people who had their freedom protected versus people who had their freedom limited via a mandate. Okay, so that's our first study. The second study is going to stay on the topic of vaccines, but we're gonna pick up a different theoretical idea that really stood out to us during the mandates. My collaborators on this project were Lauren Chris and Brian Quick from the University of Illinois, and Jules Barbati, who is a doctoral student at the U of A. And what we became interested in is this idea of threat directedness, because most of the research on reactants, as I mentioned, looks at direct freedom threats. So I limit an audience's freedom, and then I see what happens. I tell people they can't smoke, or they must exercise, or whatever, and then I look at the effects. Indirect freedom threat happens when we observe someone else have their freedom threatened. And so way back in 1966, Brehm says in his first book, he says, if the loss of a free behavior to an observed person could just as well happen to oneself, then one's own free behavior is threatened. So what he's saying, in other words, is that freedom can be threatened vicariously. If I view someone else's freedom threatened, have their freedom threatened, my freedom can be threatened as well. And so we got to talking about this and thought, this is kind of novel. Like, I know there's a little bit of research on it, but it's all done in kind of an unusual way, in the sense that it's not really an ecological validity argument I'm making as much as when would this ever happen in real life? And then the pandemic comes along and we see Arizona doesn't impose these mandates, but Maryland does. Well, what happens when people in Arizona see people in Maryland have their freedom threatened? And so what we wanted to do is test that idea. And we did that in the context of a traditional experiment. And so what we did is we had a 2x2 design. We manipulated threat directedness, whether it was targeted at the person reading it, or it was targeted at another group. And then we manipulated magnitude in the context of sanctions. So were there sanctions for noncompliance or there were no sanctions? And the way this worked is we collected data in 2021, which is when the pandemic came out in the spring. And the premise of our study was that the Board of Regents is considering a vaccine requirement. And the way that was going to work is if you're returning in the fall, you are going to have to be vaccinated. And that's either, if you don't, there are going to be sanctions or they're not. So that was the sanctions part. The directness part was we told students that it's either happening at your campus or the other campus. So we had students from the University of Arizona and the University of Illinois. So the way that would work is if I'm a student at the University of Illinois, I would either get a message that said it's going to happen on your campus. That's a direct threat. It's happening at the U of A. Or an indirect threat would be it's happening at the University of Illinois. So the potential then is that we're capturing the effect of whether the threat is targeted to you or it's targeted to another group and you're observing them have their freedom threatened. And so what I'm going to do is I want to just hit the highlights here and make sure we can get through everything. So I'm going to focus on just our key finding. And so what we expected then was we didn't expect an indirect threat to be more potent than a direct threat. We thought that a direct threat would be most potent, and it would be even more potent when there's sanctions. And so in our model, we found that threat directness here did have a bigger effect on freedom threat. Sanctions had a bigger effect on freedom threat. What I want to point out, though, is this threat directedness by magnitude interaction. And I'm not sure where this extra writing is coming from. Maybe it's just on my screen. But what we found then is that the interaction was not what we were a bit surprised. So what we found was that threat and reactance were greatest among participants receiving an indirect threat. So the way this worked was when a student from Arizona read that the mandate was being considered at the University of Illinois, they experienced more freedom threat and more reactance than at an Arizona student who read about the mandate being imposed at Arizona. So if we put this in the context of Maryland, the folks at Maryland had less freedom threat when they thought it was going to be imposed at Maryland than they did when they thought it was going to be imposed in Pennsylvania, for example. So Pennsylvania, the vicarious threat produced greater perceived threat and reactance than did the actual threat. And this was kind of an unusual finding, but what we reasoned was that, well, if you think about it, it's not that unusual. It kind of makes sense. If you're a student at Arizona and you say, oh, wow, Illinois is doing that, how bad is it going to be here? Or if you're a student at Illinois, oh, wow, if Arizona is imposing all this, what are they going to do at the U of I? And so the idea becomes the threat that we don't know, the threat that we see when we think it's coming our way, we think, oh, it's going to be so much worse than what it actually is. And so we think what's happening here is people are inflating because they don't know what's going to happen in their own situation. They're building that up and making it something bigger than it really is. There's a saying, right? Like the devil we don't know is worse than the devil we know, or something like that. But it's that kind of an idea that uncertainty we fill in with a worse situation than happened to other people. And so it leads to more freedom threat and reactance. And so the takeaway of this study then is that indirect threats can foster a kind of a vicarious reactance. And so we experience reactance as a result of having other people have their freedom threatened. Okay, so I want to stay on the theme then of mask mandates. I'm sorry, I want to stay on the theme of threat directedness, but turn our attention to a different kind of a mandate. In this case, look at mask mandates. And this is a study that pulls through this theme of threat directedness, but looks at it in a little bit of a different way. One of the things that I was part of an interdisciplinary team during the pandemic. I was working with folks, Phil Harbor here, Echo Warner, Gandhi Leroy, they're all, Phil's in public health, Echo is a PhD in nursing, and Gandhi is in MIS. And so what we did is we came together and we had collected a bunch of Twitter data at the outset of the pandemic. And what we realized, and we were looking through the data, is that we had a lot of stuff about masks and mask-related tweets. And so what I thought was, wow, this is a really great opportunity to look at what happens, a different way to look at threat directedness when these states imposed mask mandates. And so mandates were, as you recall, in Maryland, you must wear a face covering in public spaces. In the data set we had 14 states that had mandates and 35 without. And so we thought, wow, this offers us a novel opportunity to look at the effects of mandates in a kind of a different way. So as opposed to self-report, we can get at how people are expressing their feelings about masks. And so one of the reactants is one of two theories or theoretical frameworks we use in this project. And so I'm going to highlight that part, but definitely pull through the other, where we talked about moral anger. So let me give you some insights on our data, and then that'll set us up to begin to talk about what we did and what we found. So when we collected data, Twitter was still Twitter, it wasn't X, and the API was not, data were hard to come by. So the way it worked was you as a user could query the API and get 1% of the fire hose at that time. And but the way it worked was you could only get a limited amount of data. And so if you wanted to construct a large sample, what you had to do is keep querying the database. And so, or querying the API. And so what we essentially did is for 10 weeks, every day, we collected the maximum amount we could 4 times per day. And so we searched a series of COVID-related keywords every day for 10 weeks, 4 times a day, aggregated that, and what we ended up with is 1.87 million tweets. At the time, there was no way to just get data in bulk. It was like, if you want it, you got to kind of build it up. And so we did that from April 8th to June 28th, which is right at the very start of the pandemic. One of the things then that stood out to us in reviewing that data was the idea of there was a decent amount of talk about masks in the data. People were had varying views. And so what we wanted to do is we limited the data to mask-related talk by just searching the keywords mask. That asterisk there is a wildcard, so it said masking, masks, masked. It would pick up all those, and the same thing with face covering. So then what we did is, of those 12,000 tweets, or of those tweets we had that talked about masks, explicitly mentioned masks, we then searched them for an anger word. And what we did is we used linguistic inquiry word count. It's Luke. That's Pennybaker software. I suspect a number of you are familiar with it. It has a dictionary with anger words in it. And so we essentially searched each tweet to say, are there any anger words in there? And if a tweet had a mask, the word mask or face covering, and an anger word, we called it an angry mask tweet. One of the things we noticed, though, about those 12,000 tweets is they were varied in their perspective on masks. So we had a set of tweets that were very much in favor of mask wearing and expressed anger. And then we had a more traditional set, which is what you'd expect, that were anti-mask. And so we had human coders then go through and label each tweet as being pro-mask or anti-mask. And I'm going to give you a sense of what those look like and on the next slide. But what we also did is from each state, from each tweet, we were able to, not every tweet, but for a number of the tweets, we were able to geolocate. Where are they coming from? And so we knew when they were made, where they were coming from, and we could use that information to figure out, is this pre-post mandate in a state, or is this coming from a state that doesn't have a mandate? So we're using the timestamps and the geolocation, we could get a sense of, okay, these are sort of a version of public sentiment, at least on Twitter, about masks before and after the imposition of these masking mandates. Okay, so I said there are 2 types. So these tweets then are, I cleaned them up so that there's no profanity, but all the, I'm not going to take credit for any of the typos in the tweets. They're all the original. But we saw 2 sets. One set expresses opposition to masks. And so this tweet's a good example of that. And I think this is what most people would, if I told you that I studied angry mass tweets, this is probably what you'd think of. My job is making all the employees wear surgical masks starting Monday. Are you serious? Do I look like a sheep? This is unnecessary, excessive, and stupid. Beaches are opening and the virus is nothing but hype. So I think that's the common sentiment. I think that's what most people would think of in terms of an angry mask tweet. It's a tweet that's angry or opposed to mask wearing. So it's anti-mask. A pro-mask tweet, though, were tweets that were angry because others weren't wearing masks. So this one says, I'm sitting in a doctor's office. People are required to wear masks. Half of their masks are undone or around their neck. WTF. I'm double masked. This virus is highly contagious and kills people. So the pro-mask tweet then expressed anger because others aren't wearing masks. Others aren't following guidelines. Others are putting me or my community at risk. So then the anger then is not about the legislation, but it's about others' failure to conform to the mask wearing protocols. So again, we had every single tweet. We knew when it came from, we knew where it came from. And so what this allowed us to do is to test some ideas stemming from both reactance theory and theory related to moral anger. So for anti-masks, anti-tweets, anti-mask angry tweets, what we expected to see an increase after mandates. If mandates are a freedom restriction, then people should respond to that by expressing anger. We know that anger is a core component of reactance. And so what we'd expect is that angry mass tweets will increase after mandates. Pro-mask anger, though, we thought from the perspective of anger as a moral emotion, that those sorts of ideas, we thought that, well, don't mandates, what they actually do is they codify masks as part of the public good. And so masks become this part of protecting our community. And by violating that and not wearing a mask, someone is actually putting the community at risk. So we thought that what mandates might function as is, for another group of people, mandates could function as this solidification of a public mask as a public good and a beneficial thing to society. And so that post-mandate, we see people become more unhappy that others weren't wearing them. So we could see potentially pro-mask anger as well. So let me show you what we found. So what we have here is, this is tweets from states with mandates. And in particular, this is anti-mask angry tweets. So on the Y, we have the probability of an anti-mask angry tweet. On the X, we have whether it's before the mandate or after the mandate. And each of these facets then is a different time period. So this is 1 week before and after, 2 weeks before and after, 3 weeks before and after, 4 weeks before and after. In the background there, you see the raw data. So that's the number of tweets, that's the data from an individual state. So again, this is an analysis, as with the first study and the final study, is the level of analysis is at state in a time period. So then what we found was no difference. We'd expect if from a psychological reactance explanation, if we were to see direct freedom restoration, we would see more angry mass tweets after mandates than before, but we didn't. And it didn't matter what time period it was. You can see in the center, there's a dot, that's the mean, and then their confidence interval. These confidence intervals totally overlap for all four. So there's no difference before and after in angry mass tweets. I'm sorry, yeah, angry anti-mask tweets. But there was a difference in pro-mask angry tweets. So again, this is the same plot, except what we have here on the Y is the probability of a pro-mask angry tweet. This is 1 week before and after mandates, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and you can see that consistently every single time period after mandates, there are significantly more pro-angry mass tweets. And so this really gets back to that idea of anger as a moral emotion. And we're getting a little bit away from reactance, but it covers the idea that what mandates seem to do is they seem to codify masks as part of the public good. And people who don't wear masks then become threats to that public good. And that can create this moral emotion of anger and these angry responses. And so in terms of looking at a direct effect, we did not see what we'd expect from reactance, but we did see what we'd expect from theorizing about anger as a moral emotion. So again, these are all tweets coming from states with mandates before and after. The other thing we wanted to look at is, well, what about states without mandates? Because again, Arizona is a state without a mandate. And someone like me sitting in Arizona, I'm saying, well, wait a minute here. I don't have a mandate, but I see Connecticut has one. And then wait, New York just adopted one. And now Maryland has one. And California just got one. And now New Mexico has one. What happens to someone like me or people like me in my state that don't have mandates? And so what we wanted to look at is pro-mask anger and anti-mask anger over time as more states adopted mandates. And so what we found is that on the top, we have, again, this is the probability of either anti-mask anger or pro-mask anger on the Y. The X is the number of other states with mandates. So I'm in Arizona, Connecticut is 1, New York is 2, Maryland is 3, and then they just keep adding up. So over time, we see there's no change in anti-mask anger. It's actually a slight decline, but it's not significant. But as other states adopted mandates, we just didn't see any sort of a difference. But with pro-mask anger, you can see it does pick up over time, and this was a significant and positive effect, is that as other states around the country adopted masks, we saw an increasing amount of pro-mask anger from people in states without mandates. So if you're in a non-mandate state and you're just like, everybody is getting one of these mandates and we're not getting one, we see increasing pro-mask anger, and that fits the form of this idea of mandates codifying masks as part of the public good and making me more angry and expressing that anger on Twitter. So the takeaway here is that, so there might be contexts where mandates are justified. Some of the hand-wringing about are mandates going to be a problem at the beginning of the pandemic because of reactants, it seems like there are contexts where, despite limiting freedom, they don't produce results consistent with reactants, at least in the context of masks. But the pro-mask trends then reflect a moral anger that suggests that what these mandates did is made masks part of something, part of protecting the well-being of others, or masks became part of social order, and people who didn't comply with those were violating social order, and thus we were seeing people respond with moral anger. Okay, so the last study I want to talk about then involves what was inescapable, I think, to all of us during the pandemic, and that is that health behaviors became politicized. And I don't think we're turning, it feels like we reached a watershed where we might not be able to turn back from as healthcom folks, that health has just become a political issue for good or bad. A number of scholars have noted that the concept of personal freedom in political research really maps onto the way Brehm talks about it in terms of this personal autonomy. And then there are also a number of scholars, not a number, but several who sort of connected COVID-related restrictions or freedoms with Republicans being more sensitive relative to Democrats. And in particular, mask mandates, there's been some literature connecting Republicans as being more likely to become reactant than Democrats. Now, if we talk about another topic like abortion, you oftentimes hear in Democratic discourse, you hear a lot about abortion as a freedom issue, where you don't hear it as much from Republicans. And so that might be a case where it's flipped. In the context of COVID, though, we saw definitely more Republicans talking about mandates as being problematic in terms of freedom than we did Democrats. So what we wanted to do is look at how political ideology impacts the adoption of mask behavior, mask wearing, and also look at not just the imposition of mask mandates, but what happens when we take those mandates away? What happens when we remove them? And so what we did is we leveraged some secondary data from the COVID States Project. And we had 38 states that imposed a mask mandate. And so what we did is we looked at a self-reported mask wearing before and after in each state. Again, the unit of analysis is a wave within a state. So a wave of a survey within a state. And then we looked at before and after the imposition of mandates and before and after mandates were removed. And so the COVID States Project, I was not a part of it. It was an interdisciplinary group. There's some comm folks involved. Basically, they got a grant and they collected data from every state in the country 16 times over the course of the pandemic. I think they're still collecting, actually. And the data are publicly available. And the reason we use them is twofold. One, they had representative samples from every state in the United States for each and every wave. And two is one of the questions they asked was, how closely have you been following recommendations for wearing a face mask outside of your home during the previous week? And in the data that are publicly available that we have access to, they aggregate that into very closely or not. So you got a dichotomous outcome variable, which is tricky to work with, but doable. And so what that allows us to see is over time, ranging from April 2020 to January 2022, we can see within each state what proportion of the population was wearing a mask or wasn't. So what proportion self-reported. So we aggregated that data with data from state level political partisanship, and we just took the 2020 election results and we said, what proportion voted for Trump, what proportion voted for Clinton, we took the difference. And then we got case rates from CDC. So these were just new infection rates per week. And we aggregated that all into one data set. And what that allowed us to do was to conduct what's called a difference in difference test. So we can see, does the change in mask wearing pre-post mandate, is that different among different groups, like Republican states versus Democratic states? So again, the unit of analysis here is all at the state level. So the first analysis we looked at was what happens before and after the imposition of a mandate that requires mask wearing. And what we found that in general, people were self-reported being more likely to wear masks after mandates. So the odds ratio of 1.98 suggests that after mandates, people were 1.98 times as likely to wear masks as before, and that's significant. But there was a difference, there was an interaction between ideology. And so the level of increase depended upon the nature of the state, whether it was red or blue. And what we found was that red states were 1.89 times as likely, but blue states were 2.12 times as likely. So what this means in short is that blue states were much more likely to adopt masks, not much more, but they were significantly more likely to adopt masks than were red states following mandates. And this fits with reactance theory. If Republicans are more sensitive to these COVID-related mandates, then they should be less inclined to adopt masks following mandates. That's what we found. So again, this is before and after mandates are imposed. This next analysis looks at the removal. So I talked about almost all the researchers on the imposition of freedom threats. We had the opportunity to look at what happens when we take that freedom threat away. So you have to wear a mask now in Maryland. And then after, I think it was June 2021, you didn't have to. So you're getting your freedom back. What happens? Is it the inverse? We found that there was a significant decrease in mask wearing after removal. That odds ratio is less than 1. That means the odds are less likely than after than before. But we found a three-way interaction between ideology and COVID infection rates. And so when infections were low, we found what we expected, that Republicans were most likely to stop wearing masks relative to Democrats. When infections were high, though, we found that Democratic states were actually more likely to report a decrease in mask wearing. So let me show you what this looks like. I think it'll be easier to put together. So on the Y, we have probability of mask wearing. On the X, we have before and after mandates. And then these facets are case rates. So how prevalent was COVID in your community at that time? When cases are low, 0.6 per 1,000 residents, we see that a slightly bigger drop off among Republicans, which is what we'd expect, right? Republicans are sensitive to this freedom threat. So when you give me my freedom back, I'm like, forget it, I'm not wearing masks. Or I at least feel that way more than if I live in a Democratic state. When case rates are high, though, we see Democratic states have more of a drop off. And that was not what we expected. We think it may have something to do with Democratic states having higher levels of mask wearing overall. So meaning that perhaps they may feel more comfortable not wearing masks because others around them are. So at the beginning, I told you this wasn't going to be a clear and clean story, and there's actually quite nuanced. And so what I'm going to try to do is create some takeaways from, well, sorry, let me back up. So the takeaway from this study then is ideology can make some groups more sensitive to freedom threats, and that we don't see this parallel response when we remove a threat as when we impose a threat. Removing a threat seems to be something different, and I'm going to pick up on that in just a second. So across all these studies then, if I can try to summarize what we found, I think it's the big thing that we all learn in grad school, and that is it depends, right? The answer to every question in grad school is it depends. It's certainly the case here. There's no, I think the effects of mandates were certainly nuanced, and we didn't see the what most people feared, or some people feared at least, in terms of people outright rejecting behaviors. What I think we found that's relevant to reactance theory is variations in responses to freedom threats based on the nature of behaviors. The mass data, the mass data show that people wore masks. And people were actually pro-mask, if you think about pro-mask anger. And so it may be that reactance operates differently based on the nature of the health behavior being studied. And so I think that's something that we could definitely look at going forward, is do more cross health behavior comparisons of how reactance works, and not just assume that it works uniformly across all types of health behavior. A second, I think, opportunity we have is to begin looking at this vicarious reactance. I think for me at least, what the pandemic made clear is that, wow, there are these, especially if you think about state mandates, that's a case where we see others have their freedom threatened quite frequently as states impose different kinds of restrictions. Last but not least, I think that protecting freedom is worthy of attention. That's something that I don't recall being considered in the theory. So if you think about reactance as taking away freedom, it seems like by studying what happens when we protect or give people a freedom, not give, but we make safe a freedom, how that works, understanding how that works should give us insights about limiting freedom and psychological reactance theory. So for health communicators, I think it's important to consider the nature of the health behavior. Mandates didn't result in rejection of most of our studies. In some cases, mandates led to pro-mask anger. So it's really important to consider the nature of the health behavior. And, I don't think we observed very much of any direct rejection that you might see in a classic reactance study. At best, we saw mostly indirect. And the indirect is important for us to consider, I think. Oftentimes what our main DV is, like, did they directly reject the behavior I'm advocating? I think, to me, what I take away from this is it's really important to begin to consider those other ways people might restore their freedoms, because they're likely to be as important, if not more. The last is one I talked about previously, is I just, we've reached, I know we're in health comm because maybe we don't want to do political comm. There's not a lot of people who are like, I do political and health. There are a few, right? And I don't think that's an accident, but I think that we, especially as health communicators, just can't get away from the fact that we have to be mindful of the fact that health behavior is politicized. And when we're crafting messages, when we're thinking about research, it feels like in a lot of contexts, we really need to be mindful of the political implications, the ideological implications, because they're not going away. All right. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity to share. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I'm going to open the floor to whatever questions you have.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was what a rich set of studies you've done. It's really impressive. Okay, guys, you have any questions? You can raise your hand, or you can I can call on you, or someone left a question in the chat. Um, Based on your explanation of this theory, it appears to be heavily influenced by a Western cultural perspective, which is a common issue in social science. Would you consider the possibility of generalizing this theory or finding beyond Western society? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it absolutely is. There's been a little bit of research. Brian Quick's done some stuff looking at cultural differences. And that looks at, is the threat to myself or the threat to the collective? And so that is a place where somebody could have an entire career taking reactance and looking at it through this cultural lens. And that would really, I think, enrich in our understanding of the theory, as well as just give us a more interesting body of research. So yes, absolutely. But I think that the fact that it is through a Western lens is an opportunity for someone to have a really nice series of studies or even a career.
Excellent. Anita.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us. Like Shelly, I really appreciate it and thought this collection of studies was just really well done. I want to have you think through a comment that you made of health becoming politicized. Do you think it's really becoming, or did we just see it more clearly here? So if we think about like other, social identities, African Americans, Latina folks, trans queer folks, AIDS epidemic of the 80s, wouldn't scholars from those realms saying, yeah, now it's just happening to white people in terms of the political nature of some of these health topics?
Well, first, Anita, it's great to see you, or be with you virtually at least. And as always, I appreciate your questions. It's really thoughtful. Um, yes, I think so let me define how I was using the word political. I meant political like it's being talked about by our politicians. And so, yes, absolutely. I agree 100% with what you're saying. And the other thing I really went back to when I was thinking about all these projects was seatbelts. Because seatbelts was a time when, if you remember, people were pretty upset about seatbelts, which seems totally ridiculous. I think it's entertaining to me because today it's like we would, I don't know anyone who would be like, I'm not wearing a seatbelt. You'd be upset if you couldn't wear a seatbelt. So I think, yeah, absolutely. Your point is right on the mark. I just think that what I'm talking about is particular politicians talking about it. And it feels like now, although I'm happy to be corrected because I don't claim to be a political scholar, but at least during the pandemic, maybe it was just me being surprised at how much they were talking about it, how that became a, what do they call them, wedge issue.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. For me, and part of this is becoming, as we start making changes, and I've been reading about the changes in terms of some of the blood donation with the Red Cross, and it just reminds me of the AIDS epidemic and how politicized those health behaviors were. And to me, in some ways, like I said, I just feel like we've seen this with other groups historically, and there's still some historicity here. But I think to your point, maybe in some ways, we hadn't seen something like this since the AIDS crisis of the 80s. So it is this new politicalization resurgence, as you say, in terms of the sheer amount of discourse. But I do just think what's interesting is now, again, it's implicating dominant groups in ways that these previous, I think, political moments were not doing. And I do think that that is something to comment on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And I think you raise a whole nother lens too. Is like, I was thinking about this as being a political issue, but I think they're also like an issue here for social identity researchers. It just feels like it's like, I just think when people hear the pandemic, they're like, no more, I can't take it. I don't want to talk about it. But it just was such a rich behavioral science, like natural phenomenon going on that I just think there's a lot for us to learn about the social world from the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. And I just think that your series of studies just does such a wonderful job adding to those conversations and really thinking about, in some ways, how this older theory can really still be used to provide such wonderful insights into the messaging environment. So again, I appreciate it very much, Steve.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, Anita. Steve, we got one last quick question from the chat. I think you can address it pretty quickly. I thought this case study was very interesting. Did you end up using any other social media platforms other than Twitter to find how people reacted?
No, we didn't. And the reason we used Twitter was because, well, one, it covers such a broad, because it's certainly more available than others. Like it's really hard to get, Facebook is pretty locked down. So no, we just use Twitter, and we do acknowledge that in the bias as a limitation of our study. We know that Twitter users are more likely to be educated, liberal, than the general population. So
yeah. And then now you won't be able to use it, right? X has
right,
kind of
yeah,
restricted access.
and yeah, it's frustrating, but yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Steve. This is extremely impressive. I found the studies presented. I gotta dig into those papers because there's so much information there, so much to learn. So thank you so much for visiting us today. I hope you can return in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks again for the opportunity, and I appreciate
Yeah.
all your time this morning.